Again, my name is Jason Muniz, and I come to ethnic studies in the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project after having taught ethnic studies for a few years in Oakland Unified School District. And that sort of sets the context for some of the information that I'm going to share with you today. That's where I came up teaching ethnic studies after having taught a number of years social sciences of all different varieties. Right. So that's what we're coming into this space with today, and hopefully we'll get to speak to and get a little bit more information about all of you. So let's have a second to, oh, 1 second. One last thing. A lot of folks are coming in when you're entering the room and you're seeing your name put as Devin Hess for some reason. That's my co-host. If you can go ahead and change your name, I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit. Actually, let's talk about that right in just a moment. I want to walk you through first what the 3 sessions, potentially 4 sessions are going to be about, and then I'll give you a little bit of a heads up about how to change your name for this particular webinar. So today's session 1, is really about bringing ethnic studies into your school community. If you've never had ethnic studies at your school or in your district, that's one of the things that you're going to want to, some of the things that we're talking about today are some of the things you want to focus on. Again, getting the school systems ready for your ethnic studies class or getting your classroom ready to teach ethnic studies. It's a little bit of an endeavor just to get started and get your classroom in the right space, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Tomorrow, however, the webinar that we're going to be conducting same time is really going to be about sort of integrating ethnic studies into existing K-12 courses. So if you teach world history, US history, Gov at the high school level, or whatever you may be teaching at the elementary or middle school level, we'll be talking about how to integrate ethnic studies concepts and sort of practices into those social science courses. Now, on Wednesday, this group, hopefully, if you're with us, will be constructing the big ideas, the big takeaways and the scope of the ethnic studies course, really thinking about the themes that will be going into the construction of your course and give you a better idea about how the trajectory of the year will play out. And then finally, the session 3 on Friday will be sort of taking a step in and focusing on a specific unit within the ethnic studies course. Ideally, that first unit to sort of get us started and ready for the school year with at least the fundamentals of what that first unit of the year is going to look like and how to proceed. All right, so a couple things before we get too deep into the process. First is I want to let everybody know that we're recording today's Zoom session. And if you have anybody else that wants to see this later, I'll be making this video available with the information that we share online. Also, as you can see on the screen, I do have a couple of requests regarding the participants changing their names, because we will be breaking into small groups later on. And this is done a little bit easier once we have everyone sort of change their names. So the way to do that is on your screen, find the little button that says participants. It should be at the bar at the bottom. And when you click that, please find your name. Next to your name, when you hover your mouse over that, it'll give you a chance to rename yourself. And then when you do that, please set your name to the span of the grade that you teach. So if it's elementary E, middle M, high school H, and do E dash and then your name. So that way, when we are breaking into smaller groups later on, you'll be sorted according to your grade span. It'll just work out a little bit easier.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right. So, all right. Once again, thank you again for joining us. We're about to get started. And if you want to make sure that you mute your microphones, we can begin.
Jason, just point out again that when they're looking for their name, for some weird reason, a lot of them are coming in with my name, Devin Hess. So
yeah.
they might have to find their own video if they, yourself should be at the top of the list. Okay. If it says Devin Hess, if it says Devin Hess and doesn't have my picture, then it's you, or it's one of you. But you at the top of the list, if it says Devin Hess and you don't see your name at the top and it's not my picture, then I would change that to your name. Very weird. Don't ask me why.
Well, that is definitely strange, but hopefully you'll be able to change your name to your own name and set the span of the grade that you teach correctly. Your name should be at the top of the list when you look at that participant list after myself and the other Devin. So if that's not your image next to a Devin Hess name, yeah, you just want to adjust that. All right, so without any further ado, let's get it started. Before we began the session, when you signed up initially, you should have got a message from me sometime initially or sometime last week about some 3 different readings that I asked you to take a look at. And if you have looked at those readings, great. if you haven't, we don't have a lot of time to sort of look them over right now, but Devin, my partner who you just heard from, will be sharing out the links to those specific readings in just a little bit, just so you can sort of go over them and sort of refer to them as we're starting with our work. The first of the three readings that I asked you to respond to was a reading that was presented by the Third World Liberation Front. And this was the group of students in 1968 from San Francisco State College, now SF State University, that was, once again, if you put your microphones on mute. So the SF State College Third World Liberation Front are the ones who sort of formed a coalition to protest the lack of diversity and really the Eurocentric scope of education at their specific school, trying to have that change sort of shifted throughout the schools in the university level throughout the state. So the Third World Liberation Front created some demands and some specific demands about ethnic studies and their desire to see that integrated into the practice and sort of make that something that's available throughout all the schools. Since we're looking to bring ethnic studies into the K through 12 classroom, it might be useful to take a second, take a step back and have looked at what the Third World Liberation Front initially asked for when they created the demands for it to be brought to college. So if you've seen the document already, great. If not, Devin is going ahead and paste the link to the document that I shared with you last week, so you can kind of have a look to review it. And what I'd like for you to do right now is take the next couple of minutes to sort of review that document if you can, and then respond to the link that Devin is also going to put into the chat there, which will take you to a poll. And when you're at that poll, this prompt is going to be presented to you. And the prompt is, what are some ways that the Third World Liberation Front called for transformation in education? So what are some of the ways that they actually asked for some of the changes to occur? Now, what I'm going to do while you're kind of giving me some feedback on that is I'm going to be sharing with you the results of what you've typed in here on the screen. So that way we can kind of get a better understanding of what you've seen, what other people have noticed. And after a minute or two, submitting your own answers and looking over others, we'll sort of move on. So I'll give it a couple minutes for you just to enter something and look at what people say. You can see some of our answers are coming across the screen. Establish an area of non-white studies in the United States, sure, great. Focus on history of people of color and the history of racism in institutions within the United States. Non-white people must initiate and lead the discussion. Great. We'll be talking a little bit more about that this week. Person of color, integral to the design, development, implement, and control of ethnic studies. Okay. So I'll give the rest of you folks a moment or two to go over that. And all those are definitely essential items that we want to sort of talk about as we're extending the creation of ethnic studies courses for K through 12. And sort of looking back and see what the demands were initially for ethnic studies to be brought into the university and collegiate levels. So obviously we're going to be having a much different context, or a bit of a different context, as we're looking at it through K through 12 classrooms. But it's really a good idea to think about where the concept and the demands for ethnic studies as a whole really started. What I'd like to take a second to do now, though, if you haven't done so already, is please take a moment and think about the second reading that I asked you all to engage with, because there were three, and now that we've had some time to sort of think back and sort of give ourselves some context for that first Third World Liberation Front reading, there was a second reading that I asked folks to engage with, and it had to do with the California History Social Science Framework. Now, if you've never seen that before, in 2015, California educators really just collaborated to create a document that guides social studies instruction throughout the state in terms of inquiry, literacy, civic engagement, and they really gave some definitions as to what should be covered in each of the grade levels and all the grade spans, with a little bit of attention to ninth grade. And as you know, in California, ethnic studies is currently, for the moment, an elective. And if your school site chooses to have ethnic studies as the elective for ninth graders, there's a description of what that course should look like or could potentially look like that's provided inside that framework. So if you have had a look at that framework, that document, again, Devin should be posting a link to the framework entry for ninth grade ethnic studies in the chat. So if you've looked at that before, great. If not, you can pull it up by the link that he's sharing. And then once again, you've had a chance to look that over again or remind yourself what that document was really talking about. Again, Devin's going to be placing inside the chat one more link to a different sort of feedback form where you can tell me a little bit more about your thinking in terms of this question. According to the framework, what types of instruction are ethnic studies teachers empowered to provide? What are you going to be able to teach your students according to what the state of California thinks is a green light? It's okay to go to sort of teach these ideas and concepts to your kids once they're in an ethnic studies classroom, all right? So again, I'll be putting up the poll results on the screen in just a moment. But again, you're responding to this prompt. According to the framework, that document created for California by teachers, what types of instruction are ethnic studies teachers going to be empowered to provide? What will you be able to do in your classroom? Let's go ahead and share those responses. Again, I'll give you all a couple of minutes to put together a response here. History and vocab, I think we should do more. I agree. Student-centered power analysis, sure. Righteous anger and justice when discussing intergenerational trauma and the dehumanization of people of color. Yeah, absolutely. The approach to do some of these things, what will we, I guess, focusing on and thinking about how to do as we move forward this week? The construction of race. I think that's an important part for every ethnic studies class, and ideally, if you're generating ethnic studies class for your school community, that should be something that's going to be coming up in your course. Critical inquiry, youth action, participatory research, and local histories. Absolutely, and we'll be highlighting a few of those things today. Sure, multiplicity of narratives, interdisciplinary content, identity forming forces as a key thread. Now, if you're looking at the screen, you can see the same things that I am, and it seems that folks are kind of zeroing in a lot of the discussions that we're going to be having this week, a little bit today, but more as we go forward. All right, so about half of us have put in our responses so far. And since I don't want to spend too much of our time on any one particular of the three readings, I do want to move on to the last one and give ourselves a chance to sort of respond to a prompt that relates to that last reading. So If you haven't already entered in your response, you can find a good place to maybe end your sentence or your idea, and then we're going to move on. All right. So of the 3 readings, the last one that I asked you all to engage with before we got started today, this reading is about the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. And many of you already know that the state of California last year presented a model curriculum that was really going to be used as, well, just that, a model for use of ethnic studies or creation of ethnic study courses throughout the state. That was a sort of a controversial model, and it's currently in the process of being adjusted. The current status of those changes are a little up in the air, and there's no definitive timeline about when those changes are going to be presented and what that's going to look like. But they, before they withdrew the ethnic studies model curriculum, some documents were presented that did show what the thinking was up to that point, before folks got a chance to sort of make comments and that inspired the revisions. So one of the things that I asked you to read again ahead of our meeting today was the definition, according to the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, of what ethnic studies courses should be. Really taking a look at what the idea of ethnic studies should be when it's presented throughout the state. Again, a 2-page document, and Devin will once again be placing a link to that document again in the chat room. Hopefully you've looked over this. If not, that link is there for you to sort of refresh your memory. Now, once you've had a look at that link, again, there's a different question that I would love for you all to respond to sort of set the stage for our conversation today. And this time with the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum in mind, how does the course definition of ethnic studies speak to how this discipline might shape the lives of students in our school communities? So in this case, I really want us to start thinking about the definition of ethnic studies and the implications that that has on the community that we're actually going to be serving with this course, the kids in our classroom and the larger communities that they're in, that they bring into our classrooms and all the experience that they have there. So again, speak to the course definition and how its definition might have something to do with the impact that it has on the lives of our students. And once again, the link to the poll is going to be provided within the chat. And I'll be sharing our responses right here on the screen. Again, thank you for submitting your responses, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to sort of think about that answer. I'm seeing a lot of things about empowerment and solidarity, creating a capacity for resistance, and trying to build student agency. Again, all important things that we hope to contribute to our students' lives and their communities. And I think that you're on the right track in terms of those thinkings, that ethnic studies courses do sort of give students an idea about how to go about bringing those into their own communities and their own lives. Again, the ability to build agency, feeling heard and valued. These are all things that if we are constructing our ethnic studies courses in a thoughtful way, we can absolutely bring them into our school communities. Also, just an important element to bring up here is if you're interested in seeing what the other participants in our webinar today have said in response to these 3 prompts, I'll definitely be making these prompts and the responses to them that folks have given available on a document that we're all going to have access to a little bit later on, a resource document for today's session that includes some of the links and some of the things that we're going to talk about. These responses will be included there for you to review if you'd like to sort of dig deeper into what some folks who are our peers in this work have shared. Okay. All right, so once again, we have roughly about half the participants having placed something on the screen as far as their thoughts and shared it there. I do want to move on, but I thank you all for participating. And it looks like we have most of our participants in for the session today. So again, I'd like to re-welcome you into our conversation about developing ethnic studies course for your school community. Again, my name is Jason Muniz with the ethnic studies part or section of the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project. Okay. So this question is important for us to consider in terms of our students' lives and their communities specifically. Because one of the things that we're going to want to think about when we're developing an ethnic studies course is specifically how it's going to impact the lives of those students that we're going to be sharing this course with. So I think it's time before we really get started, to take a step back and think about school community. Before we dig too deep into that, just one last reminder that I do want to have us break into breakout groups and small groups a little bit later on. So please, if you can, change those screen names to adjust them with the grade span. So again, E, if you're an elementary teacher, and then a dash in your name, middle, M, dash in your name. And same thing for high school, H, a dash in your name. So that way, when we do break out, you'll be sort of sorted in grade spans, and it'll be easier to communicate with folks who have a little bit more in common in the course that you'll be creating. Okay. So again, I'd like to talk about what ethnic studies is in terms of your specific school site. And the lens that I'm going to bring to this conversation today is what ethnic studies was, or really still is, in the school site that I taught at. So for 10 years, a little bit less than 10 years, I was a teacher at Fremont High School in East Oakland, California. And when the ethnic studies, or the opportunity to teach ethnic studies was brought to my school site about 5 years ago, I had to really think about what it was going to mean for our specific school community. It's important that we draw a distinction between that specific school community and the one that you'll be creating your course for, because ethnic studies courses should really be responsive to the community that they're built for and that they're specifically serving. The context of the information that I'm sharing with you today, though, is a school community that's, East Oakland. It's going to be a little bit different than the one that you're teaching in, but some of the principles and that will guide you towards construction of the course should be the same. And what I'm really going to model for you all today is the thinking that we all did when we were developing ethnic studies courses in our district. So that way, hopefully, you'll be able to look at what we've done and sort of extend that and sort of reshape it to be a little bit more applicable for the community that you are going to be working in. So one thing that we did in Oakland Unified School District is we created a definition for ethnic studies. Now, a lot of these meetings I wasn't there specifically for, so this was a lot of work by a lot of great people who put together a definition for what ethnic studies means in their specific school community, in our specific school community at the time. And I'd like to share that with you sort of as something that you can sort of point to sort of set the stage for your thinking for today, but also for when you're developing the ethnic studies course for your school or your district or whatever your community is. So this is what the definition was, or still is, for ethnic studies within OUSD. Let's take a moment to sit with that. Now, when I look at this definition, there's a couple of different things I like to focus on. I really like to focus on the fact that what they're literally asking teachers to do and what the end goal is. So again, ethnic studies is a content and pedagogy that humanizes and empowers all people by honoring histories and cultures of historically marginalized groups, by employing multiple disciplines and perspectives to critically analyze systems of oppression, and by promoting action in solidarity with others to transform students' lives and communities. So again, look what the asks are. Right? So we're going to be empowering all people. We'll be honoring histories and cultures of historically marginalized groups, employing multiple disciplines, critically analyzing systems of oppression. We're promoting action in solidarity with others, and with the end goal of transforming lives and communities. Now, it's not an easy task, but that's what this course is really challenging participants to do in OUSD according to this definition. Now, as I mentioned before, every school context is going to be different. And we'll be looking a little bit more about the school context in just a little bit. But it's important then that we should think about what our school community is and what we want to define ethnic studies to be for your specific school community. In a moment, Devin's going to put one more link that's in the chat. And this will be there in just a minute. And when you click the link, it should take you to a page that looks like this in your web browser, a copy document page. And this is a page that's going to, it's basically a resource page for a lot of the work that we'll be doing today. So when you get this link in the chat, please go ahead and click that and then click the button that says make a copy. You'll be able to make a copy of the share of a document that we'll all be having a similar one and that viewing. And I'm going to ask you to sort of do some work within this document around the development, and at least in the early stages of your ethnic studies course. When you do click the document open, you should see the page looks like this. Now at the top of the page, I provided for everyone some basic session resources, including the 3 readings that we've had, the slideshow that we're actually looking at right now, OUSD's Ethnic Studies Framework, which is the definition that I just showed you all, and some other information that we'll be talking about as we go forward a little bit today. Take a second, look over those. Don't click through a lot of those links though, because we'll have an opportunity to engage with those in just a little bit. But what I'd love for you all to do is take a moment and then scroll down beneath this, so that way what's displaying on your page is this section. It's a definition planning for ethnic studies. Now, typically, when we did it for OUSD anyway, this was a process that took a week to do. Folks spent plenty of time thinking about exactly how ethnic studies should be defined for their specific school site, for their specific school district. Unfortunately, because we have such limited time, I'm going to ask you just to brainstorm a few ideas about what should be included in the definition for ethnic studies in your school, your district, and brainstorm them for just a couple of minutes by typing that out in the space that's provided on that form that's there. Obviously, you're not going to be able to come up with a final draft. This is just a first step in the thinking that we want you to engage with or engage in as you're creating this ethnic studies course. Ideally, this is something that you spend a lot of time with and really have some thoughtful conversations with peers around. That's the way it was done in OUSD. And if that's not possible, it's going to be a lot of brainstorming on your own and hopefully getting some feedback for some other people who have similar goals. But for right now, if you don't mind, please take a moment and try and just brainstorm some ideas about what would go into the definition for ethnic studies courses in your school site or your school district. And I'll give you a couple minutes to sort of get some ideas down on the page before we move along. Okay. Well, if you're anything like me, that was nowhere near enough time to sort of get your cognitive juices flowing and thinking about the definition for an ethnic studies course from your school site or your school district. And sincerely sorry about that. But one thing I do want to do is take a moment to sort of think about some of the things that have come to mind. So take like a sentence or a phrase or something that you may have put in your workshop brainstorm section of your ethnic studies definition that you think that others in different school districts might want to know about or want to consider, and just kind of copy that and drop that into the chat if you don't mind. So that way other folks kind of scrolling through that chat can have a look and see some of the other ideas that have been sort of generated by some of you out there. And again, it's not a completed work. We know that this is a work in progress. And developing really the meaning or definition behind our ethnic studies courses is something that does take a lot of time. And as you'll see at the end of our work time today, there's going to be a little bit of a homework assignment, everyone's favorite thing to do. And part of that homework assignment will be to sort of refine and think about the model definition for your school site or your district site a little bit deeper and you know, kind of analyze that and develop it a little bit more. So I see some folks are putting their definitions in there. Thank you so much. I see a lot of high school teachers getting that on there. Great, thank you. And again, it doesn't have to be the complete thing. It's just an idea or phrase that you think is essential about what you've brainstormed. And maybe share that for some other folks, hopefully inspire a couple of ideas for when they're developing their own a little bit further. Yes, good. Please take another minute or so to fill those out, and then we'll be moving along.
Hello? This is Sarah. Hi, Rick. How are you?
Hi. Just to remind whoever's on the phone, you want to make sure that you're muted. Thanks. Okay. Pardon me. All right. So again, thank you for engaging in that. And it's important that we spend some time sort of thinking about those definitions as we go forward. So as you'll see at the end of our session today, there'll be a space and time to sort of think about those a little bit deeper and hopefully plan out a definition for a model of our ethnic studies course going forward. All right. So what I'd like for us to spend a little bit more time doing now is to really think about the context of our classrooms. And what I mean by the context of our classroom is like who's in the actual space that we'll be teaching into. Who are the students? What do they bring with them from the communities that they're coming from? And how does that impact the content that's going to be included into your ethnic studies course? So one thing that I'd like to always engage participants in these webinars or these sessions with is a little bit of demographic information, just to kind of look at classroom context for your school site and really throughout the state of California. And if you're coming to us from a different state, again, welcome, but we're sort of focusing on California as a state at first. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is enrollment by ethnicity for 2019-20. That school year that just finished. And that pie chart is representing is the state of California's data by ethnicity enrollment. And so as you can see down the line for the percentage total of K through 12 throughout the state, this is what ethnicity identification looks like. Again, just one kind of identity. Ethnicity identification looks like throughout the state of California. And as we're thinking about the context of our classroom, I want you to take a second and think about from the years that you've taught prior and the year that you're going to teach ahead of us, which again, will be a very interesting year. I think we can all agree. When we think about the ethnicities and the identities in terms of ethnicity that are going to be coming into our classroom, how would you quantify how many of each different ethnic group are going to be represented at your school and in your classroom specifically? So again, you see the numbers as they go along to with the state. The percentage of students who identify as African American, American Indian, Native American, or Alaska Native, Asian, Filipino, which I think is interesting that they've sort of parsed out in two different spaces, Hispanic or Latinx, Latino, Pacific Islander, white, multi-race, and again, not reported. Think about what those percentages would look like at your specific school site. On the document that I asked for you to click on and sort of type out your definitions, if you scroll to the next section, you'll see a chart that looks just like this one. And please take a moment and think about what the percentages really look like for your school site. It's going to be a tool that we use a little bit later on as we're constructing some of the things that we're going to be putting into our ethnic studies course. But to have at least a beginning of an understanding of the context of our school, we should really think about the ethnic identities of our students as a first of many steps in sort of naming different identity parts. So please, yeah, go ahead and fill those out for your school site on the chart that's there. And I'll give you all a few moments to do that. Resist the urge to scroll down and go far ahead. Please. So when I reflect back on this process, and if I had made this chart before I started the ethnic studies course, which I actually didn't, so you guys are all having a step up on my experience anyway. African-American ethnicity identity at our school would have been somewhere along the orders of 25%. Again, I taught it in East Oakland, that's Fremont High School. American Indian, Native American, or Alaskan Native, that probably would have been closer to 2 to 5%. Asian, 2 to 5%. If we're using Asian Pacific Islander, maybe a little bit larger. Hispanic Latinx, that would have been probably closer to 60%. And white probably like maybe less than 8%. So of course, specific school sites will have a different sort of breakdown than the entire state of California. And we want to account for that, because an ethnic studies course that's created for the state of California by some great big curriculum that's handed down from whomever may not necessarily be reflective of who's actually in your classrooms. And that's the point that I want to highlight here, that what's in your classroom, the students that are populating your school community, is not necessarily reflective of the larger state. So the course that's created for a statewide ethnic studies course is going to look a little bit different than what should be created for your specific school site. All right, so I'd like to take just a few minutes to think about this next part, because when we're constructing the context of our classroom, if we're only looking at the ethnic identities of our students in terms of races that have been constructed by someone with a whole lot of power to be able to construct race in general, it's really not going to be a good enough definition for our students in terms of their different possible identities, right? So I want us to take a little bit of time to think about all the other ways that our students can identify, because again, all those different kinds of identities will shape what's going to be included in our specific ethnic studies course in our specific community. So because I can't give a lot of context about different school settings, I can really only give you an idea about what the thinking in terms of accounting for different intersecting identities look like at the school setting that I taught at. And hopefully you can sort of extrapolate that and sort of make that make sense through the lens of your school community just by looking at my example. Again, I taught at Fremont High School in East Oakland. And if you know anything about that neighborhood or that community, again, I gave you a little bit about the ethnic demographic makeup of that school community. A larger picture is it's a community that goes through a lot of struggles, and there's a lot of great things about that community as well, specifically the amount of diversity and the diversity of thought and the tradition of the families in those communities. However, when I was thinking about my ethnic studies course, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just looking at just the ethnic makeup of my students. And so part of what was tasked in front of me was to think about all the other ways that my students identify. And so when you're thinking of your ethnic studies course that you're going to be developing, again, that's an important consideration. What are ways that your students identify or are identified besides just their race or ethnicity in terms of that makeup? So some things that came to mind when I was considering this question for my students were these things. The fact that I had a large number of English language learners, a lot of my students were Yemeni refugees, and a great deal of them were coming to the classroom space with different abilities than others, and had 504 plans and IEPs that were all part of the construction of any course, and specifically had to be minded when I was doing an ethnic studies course. And these things are important, and you have to also remember that these things are like visible identities, right? School sites can provide you with this data. If you use areas in California, these are all things that typically you can find out from your school. But when you're constructing that ethnic studies course and you want it to be in service of your actual school community, what you want to consider is what are some of the different identities that aren't necessarily just as visible, that are going to be playing a significant role in what your students are going to be experiencing in their lives, in their communities, and hopefully in your course. So other considerations about identity for students were these. Again, there are students in my school site that had a lot of housing instability. There are a lot of students who were dealing with immigration status problems. And these are just a couple of different identities that my students had. Some of them were assigned to them, not something that they necessarily wanted to have. Some of them are chosen identities. But these are just identities that the students are going to have to bring with them as they're entering your classroom. And so as you're creating and doing the work of setting up an ethnic studies course that's responsive to this specific school community, again, these are considerations. The identities that are really invisible. And this information typically isn't going to be revealed on any sort of intake document when they're joining the school or joining the school district. This stuff is the kind of thing that comes out with confidential conversations, and usually it doesn't come out at the beginning of school year. So that may be something that you need to consider as you're going forward and helping your students to get familiar with you as a teacher and this classroom environment. And again, a much more difficult and daunting task this year, where those initial moves of getting to know you and building community are going to be a little bit more difficult. But these are the sort of things that we want to uncover in order to be in service to those school communities. So again, the things you'll be able to see, the things that are still going to be present in terms of your student's identity that are not as visible, those are all things that you want to account for when you're constructing whatever's going to be included in your ethnic studies course. As long as you want to be serving that community, you want to be able to serve all the different ways that community identifies itself. And if we're just looking at ethnicity, we're sort of looking at it in a very limited scope and limited terms. So again, this is my school community that I taught in, but I'm sure that the school community that you're teaching is going to be different. So on that same form, scroll down underneath that pie chart and you'll see a very similar sort of chart where on the left side, it's asking you to sort of name the different ways that your students identify. Take a few moments and start to name out as many of those as you really can, knowing that list is going to be incomplete and maybe something that you're going to be developing a little bit further on. And as you're doing so, don't just think about the ways that your students identify. If you take a little bit of a step back and think about it a little deeper, also think about the students that aren't in your classroom. Whose identity isn't represented by who's in your classroom, because that also is going to influence what's going to be included in your course. If you teach in a very homogeneous school community, then perhaps the identities of folks that aren't included may be something that you want to name and emphasize in your instruction. So again, once you've sort of named out some of those identities, you'll see on the right side of that same chart, there's a place where you're going to be naming out some of the implications that the students' identities, be they assigned or chosen, that those different identities have on the construction of your ethnic studies course. So this is a little bit of the work that goes into like pre-planning this ethnic studies course, and to do this in solitude is really not the best way to sort of approach this work at all. So as you know, a little while ago, Deb and I asked you to sort of set your names up so that way there's a letter, an abbreviation, be it E, M, or H, really indicating the span of grades that you teach. In a moment, Deb and I are going to send you all to some breakout rooms with 4 folks in the breakout room. And the best way that I found to sort of populate these lists of identities and populate the list of the implications of those identities is to sort of spitball with a group of people who are teaching in the same span of grades that you are. And what that might look like is just shouting out, hey, in my school, there's a lot of newcomers. And so someone who's in your same group who sort of hears that, like, oh yeah, got to make sure we talk about the newcomers. And what does that mean for newcomers? Well, if a lot of them are from El Salvador, then perhaps we're teaching the history of colonization in Central America. Okay, so those are some of the things that like you're sort of throwing out to like the small group that you're in, and giving everybody who's in that small group an opportunity to say some of their own ideas and collect some of the ones that are being said in that space. So that way, as many of them as we can name, both identities and implications for those identities in your course, will be included in that sort of brainstorm document that you're developing. So hopefully that makes sense. That's what we're doing when we're in those breakout rooms. Again, take a moment, introduce yourself, and then just fire away with what you've written down so far and what you'd also like to continue collecting in terms of information about the ways that your students identify or are identified, and what those implications are for developing the ethnic studies course. Right? So I'll be giving you folks a few minutes to start to do some of that work. Devin is going to start sending you off to those breakout rooms in just a moment. So if you can get your document ready, and then please begin to have those interactions with your peers.
Okay, any questions
Devin,
before I send people off? Any questions before I send people out?
I have a question. On the document, it says refer to the slide for context. It says I'm not able to access it. Is that something I'm going to need?
Well, the slide that I'm referring to is the one that's on the screen right now. But
Okay.
I'll change the settings so that way you should be able to do that. I apologize.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. And if you need to come back to the main room, you can do so. Some people hadn't identified their grade band, and we can take care of that when the time comes. Okay, here we go.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully those conversations were productive, and I thank you for engaging in that. And a lot of what you've reproduced right now is some of the work that went into developing our ethnic studies course in OUSD. Started thinking about who our students were and what those identities meant for what we were going to include in the class. That by no means is the full amount of time that you should take with those thoughts. But just again, this is a sample of some of the process that we engaged with, and hopefully that you can take with you as you're doing the work of creating an ethnic studies course for your school site, for your school district, or wherever you're bringing this information to. Before we move along though, I do want to see if you wouldn't mind sharing some of the things that came out of your meetings with your smaller groups and those grade spans. Were there any takeaways that seemed useful that might be considered for others doing some of the same work? If you wouldn't mind, I asked for one person of your group to sort of represent your small group and some of the takeaways or some important things that you noticed. So if you wouldn't mind sharing the grade span and also what the takeaway was that happened in your group that you felt was powerful, that might be worthy of sharing. Again, that should be popped into the chat window there. Again, because I love for folks who are participating to have a good idea of what others are thinking, not just the small circles that happen in their own little groups. So if you wouldn't mind just copy pasting some things, or just noting some of the things that came up in your group, and let's see if we can populate our chat box with some of that info. Great, like things like readings. I love that. That's absolutely something. And if you're going to throw something like that, it might be good to also share the span of grades. I guess that's E. So, all right, you actually have the span of grades right in your names. But that's great. I mean, just naming what people are reading, what some of the things that people want to bring into those spaces, considering that you're in elementary, middle, or high school. Again, those courses look very different at those different levels. So if you're creating an ethnic studies course for elementary, some of the things that are going to be topics for discussion are going to be different than what's going to happen at your high school level, where ideally we have hopefully difficult personal identity wheels. Yeah, that's a lot. That's naming a lot of different identities. And I love the identity wheel because it really brings to light the idea of intersecting identities. And I like the fact that students can sort of name more than one place where they fall on that. That's useful. Okay. And again, great readings, wonderful. Thank you for contributing all of those, everyone who's doing that. I do want to make sure that we have enough time to sort of conclude the work that we're going to be doing in this last section. And in terms of like resources like that personal identity wheel, I'm going to see if we can cull some of the resources that were named in this sort of section and make sure that they're going to be reintroduced in the materials that we're going to use for the session 2. So if you're coming to tomorrow's session, which is about integrating ethnic studies into existing courses, that's great. I may not have all these things lined up for that session, but by the time we get to session 2, which will be on Wednesday, some of the things that may be recommended in here, I'm going to do my best to sort of gather links to as many of those as I can, so that way you can click through and sort of investigate those a little bit further when you come to the second session. That makes sense? Pardon me. Okay. So moving along, and again, feel free to keep typing those in there while I'm speaking. That's okay. I don't mind that at all. But I do want to make sure that we have enough time to engage with another part of this process that I think is important to discuss in the first day, and that's developing those community resources. In a lot of the communities that we're teaching ethnic studies in, a lot of the teachers, in my experience, don't necessarily live or have grown up in the exact same community that they're teaching in. And if that's not the truth for you, and you did grow up and you have a lot of experience living in the community which you teach, great, it sort of does give you a little bit more of a unique place to start from. But for the most part, I found that not to be the case with a lot of teachers who are engaging in ethnic studies courses for the very first time. And if that's the case, part of the work of developing this ethnic studies course is to really work on the development of those community resources that you can bring to bear to include inside your ethnic studies course. So some things to think about when we're thinking about what our community assets are is, in that community, how might the history and identities that are within that community influence the topics that you emphasize in an ethnic studies course? Again, if you're in a community that is a large percentage of newcomers, that's going to color what you're going to include in that ethnic studies course. If you're in a very heterogeneous community, that's definitely going to color the information that you're going to share in your ethnic studies course in terms of how that community came to be and come to look how it looks. If you're in a community that is very homogeneous and there's really only 1 or 2 different, let's say, racial identities or ethnic identities that exist within that community, well, then your ethnic studies course is going to need to account for that and the history of how that started. This is the place in your ethnic studies course where you have the opportunity to really lean into and talk about indigeneity, the people who are here on the land where your school community exists first. Okay? And so in the classroom community that you're in, perhaps there's a large percentage or a large contingent of students who are Native American and can draw their roots back to the land originally. If that isn't the case, though, then part of your ethnic studies course could include how the different communities that exist in this classroom came to be in this place that was once populated by indigenous people. So a lot of the history of the actual land, the actual community that your school exists on, should be included in the topics of the ethnic studies course you're going to develop, which requires you to know that, which is going to require a little bit of research and a little bit of getting to know the history of the identities that are in. Just because your school community exists in place doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily resources that are available to you to access some of those histories. So again, who in those school communities can share narratives about those histories? Cultural keepers in your school community. In developing your ethnic studies course, that's an important part of this. You know, finding the folks who are responsible or who engage in a lot of the cultural heritage appreciation and sort of honoring that goes on in your school community. If those communities exist in your classroom, it's important to bring in advocates for those communities into your classroom in terms of what the course that you're developing is going to include, how it's going to include specific parts of those histories. And it also gives students an opportunity to sort of communicate with people within their own community that are, you know, they're not distant, far off people from history. Those are actual people that are living, breathing parts of their community that have something to do with them, whether they share identities or not, they're in their community. So this is an opportunity to bring those people in to sort of share what they know about the histories and the narratives that help to create this community. All that is a long way of saying is part of the work of setting up this ethnic studies course is getting to know your community a bit more. And that's not a small piece of work. There's a little bit that goes into that. And part of what I'm hoping that you'll be able to engage in is the process of developing those community resources by going out, by finding out who the people are that you should talk to get that history, to engage with like chambers of commerce or whoever that may be in your area that sort of knows the local history, and giving students that are going to be in your courses a little bit of context about what it is that they're going to be seeing when we talk, or what it is that you're meaning when we talk about community. Ethnic studies courses, again, are not meant for everybody in the state to practice those courses the exact same way. Ideally, what they're focusing on is a specific school community that the students are in. So again, it's important for you to know those things and get to learn those things. Part of that work is going out and starting to begin to collect those resources. So once again, if you wouldn't mind returning to that form where you've all been, hopefully entering in a ton of information about all the different classroom context and definitions for our course. And you'll see at the bottom section of that page, or the next to the bottom section, is a heading that says community resources. Now, what I've provided there is a sort of an intake form for you to start to collect some of those community resources. I've given you all a couple. The first one on there is an online community of ethnic studies teachers. We're actually, as a collective in this space right now, are a community resource to each other, because we'll be helping people develop, or helping each other develop, this ethnic studies course. And I definitely suggest that you, if you haven't already done so, to take a moment and submit a request to join that online community. I know Facebook is not everybody's favorite thing, I get that. But it is a tool that we can definitely use right now to sort of build a little bit of a collaborative space to hopefully trade some ideas and think about ways that we can engage our school communities. If you're not sure how to do that, this is a good resource to ask other folks who have already done some of this work how they did it, and what are some steps they can that you can follow to sort of replicate and do some of the work in cultivating those community resources. Similarly, if you're not interested in joining that online community, that's again fine. That's a resource that's available to you. But there are other resources that I know the history project that I'm a part of, the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project, does have a resource called Making History. And there's a link to that website as well, where we use a little bit of community resources, things that exist in your community, to help build those narratives about how your community came to be. And that includes, like doing some active research on your own in terms of like visiting actual sites, using like monuments and a lot of different things that exist in your community, who to reach out to sort of get some of that information to build those community narratives. There's a lot of guidance on that link there that kind of tells you about what to do to build those out. And again, after that, a bunch of lines where you can sort of fill in your own information about what the resource is, who to contact, and some basic information about how to use that resource. Again, all things that you're going to want to take into consideration before we really start to build out the ethnic studies course that you've been thinking of setting up for your school side of your district. Identity of your students, the big ideas of what the definition of the class is, and the community resources. Those are the three things I'm hoping that you're walking away from today's instruction with, and thinking about that you need to develop and grow a little bit more before this ethnic studies class comes to fruition in a way that makes sense. Some of the things that I'd like to bring up is that the first year, and if this is your first year in ethnic studies and developing the course, the first year is a bit of a challenge, because you'll be trying out a lot of things that may or may not work. And in the first year working on this course, you should really be thinking about all the things that have been successful and things that need a little bit of revision. I used to keep a list called Keep It, Chuck It, Fix It. And every single day after every single lesson, I would put whatever we just did into one of those categories. And it was a good way to sort of reflect at the end of the year and think about what worked, what didn't work, what worked sort of, but needs some revision. And you'll want to do some thoughtful work around revising the course at the end of the year, no matter what it is that you come up with. Now, going forward, the next time that this group meets, ideally, will be on Wednesday, where we'll talk about what to do next after you've considered these three things of community resources and identity of your students, and also the definition of your course. Once you've sort of done this thinking, the next step in the process is really around thinking about the themes that will be included in your ethnic studies course, and how that sort of connects to a bigger sort of inquiry question that you can sort of pose to your students over the course of the year that relates to ethnic studies and really connects to their community again. So that's what we're going to be doing primarily on Wednesday's take, where we'll be looking at themes to include and how the work that we've done already in today's session sort of extends to those themes. Tomorrow's session is really designed for teachers who are integrating ethnic studies into an existing K-12 ethnic studies course. And if that's your idea and that's something you want to do, please come to that one. You're welcome to sort of get ideas about what we've talked about today and how those relate to ethnic studies courses, or really social sciences courses that sort of integrate concepts and sort of practices of ethnic studies. But that's tomorrow's session. Wednesday, we're looking to take a look at, kind of a unique ethnic studies course and how to develop that further thematically. And we're ending a little bit sooner than I thought, and that's fine. So we'll give some time for some questions. So one last thing I want to bring up before I sort of throw out to some questions for the group is that very last section that's on our page. That's the homework section. If you look at the section there, again, some of the things that it would be great for you to sort of think about and engage with before we meet again on Wednesday are these. First, sort of refine that district or school definition of ethnic studies. Again, we only looked at a few minutes. That's something that should require a little bit of thought and ideally some collaboration. So spend a little time with that before we meet again on Wednesday. And again, continue that work of naming your school's ethnic demographics and continue to populate the list of other student identities, as well as those implications for the course construction. That's some important work to engage with, especially when we're going to look at themes and how to construct the course in the next step. That second part where we did the listing of ideas and listing of implications, that's going to be important for the work that we're going to do next. And also what we just talked about, naming, sort of giving specific identity to the resources that we're going to sort of consult or collaborate with in terms of culture keepers for our school community, and sort of naming those out, making sure we have contact people, have an approach that we're going to engage with to do that work. As you'll see when you go forward, you're going to want to be able to pull upon as many community resources as possible, especially when those difficult conversations start to come up and we're not sure where we stand, especially if you identify in a lot of different ways than your students, be that racially, ethnically, or gender identity, in a lot of different ways that your students are experiencing their own identity. When those difficult conversations are going to come up, and they're probably going to come up, you're going to want to have some culture keepers, some people, resources within your school community that can sort of speak to those differences in a way that makes sense, and sort of make that part of your classroom culture, that you're bringing in people of the community whenever there's places that you're not as comfortable kind of sort of speaking to stuff. For those of you who are fans of extra credit, I threw that last link on there. And we brought up earlier today the California State Model Curriculum. That link that you see for link 4 is actually the appendices for that. And when you click through that, it's a whole lot of syllabi that were created by people throughout the state of California teaching ethnic studies in a lot of different school communities. As I said, ethnic studies should be really specific towards your school community, but maybe the school community that you teach in is very similar to the ones that are listed there, or you can just kind of take ideas from what they've presented in their school community and maybe sort of pull those into some ideas that you already have percolating for your school identity and your school setting. So it's a big document. It's like 200 pages of syllabi, and unless you're highly motivated to sort of pour over that information, I don't necessarily do that if you don't want to. But it is a good resource to have, and if it's something that you sort of like to get an idea about what's out there, please, by all means, use that link. It's there. That information should be shareable for everyone to sort of look at. It's not as readily available online anymore because the folks who were working on the model curriculum kind of took a lot of that stuff down off the internet, but I was crafty, so I saved that stuff, and I wanted to share that with folks like you today, just in case you want to have a good idea of what other people have done. With that said, we have about 7 or 8 minutes before our session time is today. So if you have questions that you'd like to share, by all means, please go ahead and share those out now. I guess if you want to unmute your microphones or post something in the chat, hopefully I can get to as many of those as I can. But besides that, thank you all for being here, and thank you all for taking on ethnic studies, especially in a time where there's a lot of disruption going on in our education, in our classrooms. You're all to be commended for taking on this very, to my eyes, important work. So thank you for that. And yeah, folks, if you have any questions.